Princess Charlotte had entered the private Windsor meeting, expecting a routine conversation about her future duties. Instead, trustees placed a sealed ivory envelope before her and revealed that Queen Elizabeth had left one final request specifically for her great-granddaughter. The young princess did not speak. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her eyes filled with tears, and Prince William immediately understood that this was not an inheritance announcement. It was something far more personal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charlotte stared at the envelope as the lead trustee opened Elizabeth's instructions. The royal household, the institution organizing duties and records, had been ordered to reserve 3 things for her: the monarch's youth service patronage, handwritten journals, and an annual service day at Windsor. A patronage is a royal link to a charity. But this request went beyond ceremony. It placed a legacy in Charlotte's hands. Catherine watched her daughter read the first sentence, stop, and lower the page. The Princess of Wales moved closer but did not interrupt. Charlotte had learned that her great-grandmother had studied her character enough to shape a role around it. She was not being offered jewels, rank, or power. She was being asked to protect a tradition built on compassion, duty, and service without applause. William shifted his chair toward her and asked whether the decision had to be made that day. He felt proud, but fear remained. He knew responsibility could swallow childhood, and he would not let admiration for Elizabeth become a silent command. The trustee revealed the sentence that changed the room. Elizabeth had written that the responsibility should pass to the child who understands that being seen is not the same as being useful. Charlotte looked down. Catherine saw the words strike deeper than any title. Another condition followed. A second sealed instruction could be opened only after Charlotte accepted the duty. No parent, advisor, monarch, or official could decide for her. The choice had been protected from the institution itself. Charlotte wiped her cheek and placed both hands flat on the table. "Did she really believe I could do it?" she asked. The lead trustee answered without hesitation. She was certain. Catherine turned toward William and caught him staring at the envelope. His expression carried recognition, not surprise. She realized he might understand why Elizabeth had built such a barrier around Charlotte's future. But to understand why Elizabeth placed this burden in Charlotte's hands, the family first had to confront what each of them stood to gain, and what they were terrified she might lose. To the public, Princess Charlotte was the composed young royal who seemed instinctively aware of every camera and every ceremonial step. Inside the family, she was still a daughter who teased her brothers, sought her mother's reassurance, and watched her father carry responsibilities that often left him silent. Elizabeth's request suddenly joined those 2 versions of Charlotte together. For William and Catherine, the revelation was beautiful. It was also the beginning of a fear neither parent could ignore. Charlotte stood close enough to the succession to understand duty, yet far enough from the throne to possess a freedom George might never know. The succession, the order determining who inherits the crown, could shape childhood before a child understood its cost. Elizabeth had recognized that difference. During family gatherings, memorial services, and ceremonies, the late queen had watched Charlotte notice frightened children, steady younger relatives, and remain composed without seeking praise. Catherine felt the honor deeply, but pride soon turned into unease. She feared her daughter would begin measuring her worth against the impossible image of a monarch she adored. Charlotte might believe every mistake weakened Elizabeth's faith in her, and that thought troubled her mother more than criticism. William understood that danger. Adult decisions had shaped his youth before he possessed the words to resist them. The prince remembered how duty could be presented as love, until refusal felt like betrayal. He would not allow admiration for his grandmother to become an argument that Charlotte should surrender childhood. George listened quietly when his parents explained the request. Instead of jealousy, relief crossed his face. He admitted that he had worried Charlotte would one day be treated only as his supporter, never as someone with a purpose of her own. His response revealed how closely he had studied the future waiting for them both. Louis sensed the change without understanding the documents. He found his sister sitting alone after the meeting, and placed a folded note in her hand. "You do not have to be brave every minute," he had written. Charlotte's composure finally broke, and her younger brother stayed beside her until the tears passed. That evening, Catherine entered Charlotte's room and found the sealed envelope untouched beside the bed. Her daughter confessed that she wanted to accept, but feared disappointing someone who was no longer alive to forgive her mistakes. Catherine promised that Elizabeth's trust had never been meant to become a prison. William remained unconvinced. One question still disturbed him. Why had the Queen designed the request so no palace authority could interfere? The answer lay in a single ceremony years earlier, a moment so quiet at the time that no one understood it had become the point of no return. The trustees' records traced Elizabeth's decision back to one exact afternoon at Windsor Castle. It was not inspired by a grand procession, a state banquet, or a carefully staged royal appearance. It began after a children's remembrance service, when a nervous young guest dropped a commemorative wreath in front of the assembled family. Courtiers froze, cameras turned. Yet before any adult reacted, Charlotte stepped away from her place, lifted the wreath, and quietly restored the child's dignity. Amelia Hart was only 8, and grief had already placed a burden on her no child should have carried. During the Windsor Children's Remembrance Ceremony, an event created to honor young people who had lost relatives, she approached Queen Elizabeth with a commemorative wreath. Her hands trembled. One step went wrong, the wreath slipped, and the silence that followed felt harsher than the mistake itself. Charlotte moved before protocol could decide what should happen. She walked to Amelia, lifted the fallen wreath, and held it beside her until the frightened girl was ready to continue. The young royal never searched the room for permission. She did not turn toward the cameras. She simply stayed beside Amelia, protecting her from the humiliation of standing alone. Elizabeth remained composed, but the moment followed her after the ceremony ended. The Queen called her private secretary, the senior aide responsible for confidential royal business, and asked who had reacted first. When the answer came, she fell silent. Then she requested a private conversation with Charlotte. The monarch thanked her great-granddaughter for helping Amelia. Charlotte seemed confused by the praise. She just needed somebody beside her, she replied. Elizabeth heard more than childhood innocence in those words. She heard the kind of service royal training could encourage, but never manufacture. That evening, the Queen dictated a memorandum, a formal written instruction, declaring that service sometimes had to be protected from hierarchy. Charlotte, she decided, needed a future responsibility, separate from George's destiny and untouched by the competition surrounding rank. Elizabeth feared palace officials might later weaken the idea, reduce it to ceremony, or redirect it toward a more senior royal. She therefore placed the request under independent trusteeship, meaning appointed guardians would protect it from palace control. A preserved account recorded the decisive moment. Elizabeth removed her glasses, laid her pen across the memorandum, and said, "Do not let them make this about position." But someone tried. The trustees discovered that one senior royal had sought to revise the arrangement, insisting Charlotte should never receive an independent public role without the monarch's authority. That challenge had never disappeared, and once the sealed request resurfaced, the disagreement moved from old correspondence into a confrontation inside Windsor itself. The first real clash erupted behind the closed doors of a Windsor drawing room. King Charles believed Elizabeth's request should be honored publicly and immediately, presenting Charlotte as a symbol of continuity during a difficult period for the monarchy. William rejected the idea before the briefing papers were fully opened. The future king was not opposing his grandmother's wishes. He was opposing the machinery already gathering around his daughter, and his restraint began to fracture when officials spoke about Charlotte as though she were not in the building. Charles insisted that delay would weaken the message. A formal announcement, he argued, could connect Elizabeth's reign with the next generation and reassure a monarchy under pressure. The sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch, normally stands at the center of such public decisions. Yet this request had been designed to resist that instinct. William refused to accept urgency as duty. He reminded his father that the sealed instruction required Charlotte's consent before strategy, ceremony, or approval. He knew how quickly admiration could become pressure. He would not let officials turn his daughter's grief into a symbol before she had chosen the burden herself. Charles held his ground. With no junior aides present, he told William that duty rarely waits for readiness. The future king answered that inherited responsibility was one thing, Adults creating emotional obligation around a child was another. His voice remained low, but the restraint made every word sharper. Catherine ended the argument's illusion of control. She told the king that Charlotte had spent the night fearing she might fail a monarch who was no longer alive to forgive her. The Princess of Wales did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words exposed the human cost hidden beneath phrases like continuity, legacy, and service. Charles admitted that Elizabeth had warned him Charlotte might receive a private assignment. The Queen had withheld the conditions because she feared advanced knowledge would allow the palace to reshape them. That confession changed William's anger into suspicion. A trustee opened a file. During Elizabeth's final year, an advisor had requested that the future patronage be placed under sovereign approval, giving the monarch final control. It carried a handwritten refusal from the Queen herself. William pushed the prepared announcement across the table and closed the folder. Looking directly at Charles, he said, "Nothing is released until Charlotte speaks for herself." The king agreed to delay it. Then the trustees delivered the truth. The terms had already activated, and the person holding control was waiting outside. The family had argued over emotion, childhood, and duty, but the next person to enter carried the authority to turn Elizabeth's words into irreversible action. The woman who entered the room did not bow deeply, seek reassurance, or wait for a royal invitation to speak. Dame Eleanor Ashcombe had been appointed by Elizabeth to lead the independent trust guarding the request. She carried no crown authority. Yet in this matter, even the king could not dismiss her. As Charlotte watched from an adjoining room, Eleanor informed the family that the late queen had deliberately built a wall between her final wish and palace control. Eleanor opened the file and spoke with the calm of someone who had prepared for resistance. A trust is a legal structure that places assets and decisions under appointed guardians rather than ordinary palace control. As its lead trustee, she alone carried responsibility for executing Elizabeth's instructions exactly as written. The arrangement was broader than anyone had expected. It controlled the journals, the future patronage, the protected funding, and the annual service day at Windsor. Charles could support the project, but he could not appoint its leadership, absorb it into another royal foundation, or remove Charlotte once she accepted. Eleanor's voice tightened only once. She revealed that Elizabeth had made her promise, in a recorded private meeting, that no family pressure would ever replace Charlotte's consent. The trustee had carried that burden since the Queen's death, knowing the day might come when loyalty to the crown required her to resist the monarch himself. Charles removed his glasses and set them down. He asked whether his mother had trusted outsiders more than her own successor. The pain in his question changed the room. This was no longer only a struggle over authority. It was a son confronting the possibility that Elizabeth had anticipated his interference. Eleanor answered by reading from the preserved record. Affection, the Queen had written, did not eliminate institutional instinct. Loving relatives could convince themselves that control was protection, especially when the family's future appeared to be at stake. Then came the financial safeguard. Elizabeth had created a protected fund from private resources, ensuring Charlotte's work could not be starved of money, folded into another institution, or used as leverage by advisors. The request could survive disagreement, embarrassment, and even royal disapproval. Charles walked to the window and remained facing away as Eleanor closed the file. William recognized the hurt in his father's silence, but he refused to weaken the protections surrounding his daughter. Eleanor then disclosed that the secondary envelope named the one royal Charlotte had to consult before deciding, and it was not either parent in the family. The revelation changed the balance instantly, because the person chosen by Elizabeth carried memories of royal duty that neither William nor Charles could offer Charlotte. When the second envelope was opened, Princess Anne's name appeared beneath Elizabeth's final instruction. The choice stunned the room. Charlotte was required to speak privately with her great-aunt before accepting or refusing the responsibility, because the late Queen believed Anne understood the loneliness of serving without being the heir. The Princess Royal did not celebrate the appointment. She read the sentence twice, pressed her lips together, and asked for several minutes alone before she agreed to meet the young girl. Anne understood immediately what her mother had asked of her. Elizabeth had appointed her as Charlotte's independent family advisor, meaning she had to explain the cost of lifelong service without pushing the child toward acceptance. The role carried no authority over the final decision. It demanded honesty, restraint, and a loyalty strong enough to permit refusal. The choice made sense, but it still wounded her. Anne had spent decades working beyond the direct line of succession, serving without the attention attached to the monarch or heir. Yet reading Elizabeth's words forced her to face a harsher truth. Her mother had planned this conversation, knowing she would not be alive to hold it herself. William watched his aunt carefully. He trusted her discipline, but feared she might present sacrifice as unavoidable. Anne answered his concern before he finished speaking. Honesty, she said, was not pressure. She would tell Charlotte that refusing the request could be an honorable act. Then, Eleanor read the private assessment preserved in the message. Elizabeth had described Anne as the family member who learned to serve without needing the crown to confirm her importance. The recognition broke through years of control. She lowered the page, looked away, and took a breath before speaking again. Anne felt the sentence strike where public praise never could. Elizabeth had recognized not only her work, but the loneliness beneath it. For one unguarded moment, the dependable daughter was simply a grieving child hearing approval too late. Trouble was already spreading. Senior staff had begun circulating draft schedules, patronage plans, and announcement strategies despite the agreed delay. Their preparation proved William's fear. The institution was moving before Charlotte had chosen. Anne entered the private library where her great-niece was waiting. She removed her ceremonial brooch, placed it on the table, and said, "Before we discuss duty, you need to know that you are allowed to say no." Charlotte listened, but her first question was not about the trust. She asked whether Elizabeth had ever regretted becoming queen. For the first time, Charlotte was no longer listening to trustees or parents. She was speaking to someone who could tell her what duty costs when no cameras are present. There were no officials in the library, no legal advisors, and no prepared statements. Only Charlotte and Anne remained, as the afternoon light faded beyond the windows. When the young princess asked whether Elizabeth had ever regretted the crown, her great-aunt did not offer a polished royal answer. She said the queen had regretted moments she missed, words she could not speak, and choices duty made on her behalf. But she had never regretted using her position to make another person feel less alone. Anne let the silence settle, before explaining why they were there. Elizabeth's request was not a command from beyond the grave. It was an invitation, built around a quality the monarch believed Charlotte already possessed. The choice mattered, because acceptance would shape years of public service, while refusal would protect the freedom her great-grandmother had deliberately preserved. Charlotte listened as her great-aunt described what the role would require. She would eventually lead an annual Windsor service day, study private journals on compassion and responsibility, and guide youth projects without becoming a ceremonial figurehead. The work would demand patience, courage, and the strength to remain useful, even when attention became overwhelming. Charlotte finally admitted what frightened her most. People would compare her with Elizabeth, and every mistake might be treated as proof that she had failed the woman who trusted her. The young princess feared admiration could become a cage. Anne rejected that fear with quiet force. Elizabeth had made mistakes, carried regrets, and never expected imitation. She had chosen Charlotte because the child helped Amelia without waiting for approval, not because she behaved like a flawless royal. Then Anne unfolded the smaller page authorized only for this conversation. Elizabeth's final message was simple. Charlotte must refuse if acceptance required her to become someone other than herself. The words changed everything. The trustees, safeguards, and private consultation were not tests designed to trap her. They existed to make consent real. For the first time, duty felt less like an inheritance and more like a promise freely chosen. Charlotte reached for the ceremonial brooch Anne had placed on the table and asked her great-aunt to fasten it. Once it was secured, she gave her answer. She would accept, but only if the first Windsor service day welcomed children rarely invited into royal spaces. Anne embraced her briefly and warned that public attention would arrive within hours. Charlotte did not withdraw. She said she was ready to speak, but the announcement had to be made in her own words. Charlotte had finally chosen, but once her decision left the library, a private promise between generations, became a public judgment on the future of the monarchy. The announcement reached the public the following morning, but it was not the legal wording that captured the country. It was a single photograph taken outside St. George's Chapel. Charlotte stood between William and Catherine, her eyes still visibly emotional, while Anne remained one step behind her. In the young princess's hands was Elizabeth's handwritten request. She was not wearing a tiara or standing beneath a crown, yet the image immediately became one of the monarchy's most powerful moments. Buckingham Palace confirmed that Charlotte had voluntarily accepted stewardship of Elizabeth's youth service legacy. Stewardship meant protecting and guiding a responsibility, rather than owning it. The announcement covered the private journals, the annual Windsor Service Day, and a future patronage linking the young royal to charitable work for children. Charlotte's own words gave the statement its emotional force. She said the honor was not about becoming another Elizabeth, or living beneath impossible comparisons. Its purpose was simpler and harder, helping young people feel noticed, heard, and welcomed into institutions that often seemed distant. Charlotte paused before saying her great-grandmother's name. Catherine watched with concern, while William kept a protective hand near his daughter without taking control of the moment. Their restraint mattered. The choice was hers, and so was the courage required to explain it. Debate followed immediately. Some commentators questioned whether responsibility of this scale should be announced while Charlotte was still young. Others argued that the safeguards around her consent proved the family had finally learned from earlier generations, when duty was often assigned before the emotional cost was understood. The next morning, the fictional front page of the London Chronicle carried the photograph beneath the headline, "Elizabeth's Last Promise, Charlotte Chooses Service." Every copy at Windsor Station sold before midday. The story had moved beyond royal procedure. It had become a national conversation about childhood, trust, and chosen duty. Families gathered outside Windsor Castle and left handwritten cards beside the gates. One child placed a small wreath carrying the message, "Thank you for standing beside Amelia." That simple tribute connected the public announcement to the forgotten ceremony that had inspired Elizabeth's decision. During a live broadcast, a veteran royal correspondent lowered his prepared notes and said, "This is not a title being handed down. It is trust being answered." By evening, those words defined the moment. Charlotte then returned inside Windsor and opened the first of Elizabeth's journals. On the opening page, waited an entry dated the night of Amelia's ceremony. Suddenly, the room seemed painfully quiet again. The world had delivered its verdict in headlines and flowers, but Charlotte still needed to hear the final judgment from the one voice that had begun everything. The first journal did not contain a grand declaration about crowns, succession, or royal destiny. On the page dated the night of the remembrance ceremony, Elizabeth had written about a frightened child, a fallen wreath, and the great-granddaughter who stepped forward when everyone else remained still. Charlotte read the entry alone at first. Then she called William, Catherine, and Anne into the room. Her voice trembled as she reached the final line, because the Queen had explained exactly why she chose her. Charlotte continued reading from the documented journal. Elizabeth believed the ceremony had exposed an instinct no training could create, protecting another person's dignity before considering protocol. Protocol meant the formal rules guiding royal conduct, yet the monarch had seen something greater. Compassion had arrived first. Elizabeth had never intended her great-granddaughter to copy her reign or carry an impossible image of perfection. The late Queen wanted Charlotte to preserve one principle: service begins when status is forgotten. That truth released the fear tightening around the young princess. She understood that mistakes would not betray Elizabeth. Losing the kindness behind the request would. William heard the change in his daughter's voice. Catherine felt it too. Their relief came from knowing the trust had given Charlotte something rare within royal life. A duty freely chosen rather than imposed by birth. Her mother no longer saw only danger. Charles later met Dame Eleanor in a recorded meeting and admitted Elizabeth had been right to separate the legacy from palace control. The king signed a statement confirming the trust's independence, meaning its guardians could protect Charlotte's work without royal interference. Charlotte asked Anne to remain her private advisor. Her great-aunt agreed, not as a supervisor, but as the person who would remind her that refusing excessive demands could also protect duty. The Princess Royal had carried service through silence. Now she would help Charlotte carry it without losing herself. Charlotte closed the journal, placed Elizabeth's letter beside it, and wrote, "I accepted because she trusted who I already was." She signed only Charlotte, leaving rank and title off the page. The request did not replace Elizabeth, or move Charlotte closer to the crown. It gave her an identity built on empathy, consent, and service, protected from control. For the family, grief became peace. For the monarchy, tradition survived without repeating old pressure. And with Elizabeth's final request accepted in freedom rather than fear, Charlotte stepped forward not beneath the shadow of the late queen, but carrying the quiet principle that had defined her all along. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.